Right, well, hello and welcome back. Uh, so today I'm introducing indirect derivations. It's similar to the conditional derivations that I just introduced in that it involves doing a proof and then at some point indenting, right? Stepping into sort of an alternate reality where we can make certain assumptions, right? Um, and then drawing some conclusions, then stepping back into reality. But instead of proving a conditional, it's a different sort of proof. So indirect derivation is what we're calling it. Some people call these reductio ad absurdum. That's the Latin, which means basically a reduction to an absurdity. Um, in our language, it's going to be an absurdity means a contradiction. So if something's absurd, it means it's crazy. It can't be true. And in our logic world, contradictions can't be true. Right? P and not P can't be true both at the same time. So the way an indirect derivation works is you get to make an assumption, and you can pull the assumption out of thin air, right? The assumption doesn't have to appear in a previous premise or anything like that. But if starting from that assumption and whatever premises you might have, if you can derive a contradiction, then you know for sure that that assumption was not true, right? Because something that's true will never give you a contradiction, and it's something that's false, you will be able to derive a contradiction. When we walk through it, it'll hopefully make a little more sense. But first, let's get clear on what we mean by a contradiction. So in our logic world, it's something of the form P, and then on another line, not P, right? Two negations of each other. Now, of course, it doesn't have to just be this atomic statement P. It can be an arbitrarily complex statement. So, for example, P and not Q, those are not contradictions. Uh, if P then Q and if P then not Q, also not contradictions, right? But the other statements here are contradictions. So if P then Q and negation, parentheses, if P then Q, those are contradictions, right? It's the exact same statement, just one of them has a negation in front of it, right? And of course, you can have more than one negation involved in a negation. So, if I had not P then Q, then I could have not P then Q, and they would be negations of each other, right? So for a contradiction for our purposes is on any given line you have some statement in logic, and then on another line you have that same statement but with the whole thing negated. Right. So let's see an indirect derivation in action, and hopefully this will be less abstract and start to make sense. So here is a proof. We've got three premises and the conclusion we're trying to derive. So the first premise, not Q, then R. Second premise, if S, then not R. Third premise, if not Q, not S, then Q. We're trying to derive Q at the bottom here, right? Now, just looking at this for a minute, if you've practiced with your direct derivations, you might realize that there's no way I could get Q with a direct derivation because I can't really get anything started because, uh, I've got all these conditionals. I don't have any atomic statements to use with those conditionals to do like MP or MT. And it doesn't look like a conditional derivation is going to help me here either because my conclusion is not a conditional. And just adding one more conditional to this pile of conditionals is not probably going to help me very much either, right? So let's see if we can use an indirect derivation. This is a perfect occasion to use an indirect derivation when you're kind of stuck. Correct. So if I decide I want to do an indirect derivation, the first thing I should do is assume the negation of the thing I'm trying to prove. So here, our conclusion we're trying to prove is Q, right? So I can assume, and I can just pull it out of thin air. It doesn't have to show up in the premises. I can just say, let's assume that not Q is true. And then my job is going to be to derive a contradiction. So on line 4, I indent, right? Make sure we're stepping into sort of an imaginary world. But I'm still free to use my premises from the real world here, right? So I indent, I assume not Q, and my justification is ASSID or assumption for an indirect derivation. Now I can use my premises 1, 2, and 3 along with my assumption, and I can start making some moves, right? Because now I have an atomic statement, or at least a negated atomic statement, that I can feed into these conditionals and do some MPs, maybe some MTs. So the first thing I notice is with line 1 and line 4, I can do an MP and get R on its own, right? Well, that's not a contradiction yet, but we're making some progress. So at least we've done something. What else we can do? I also notice that with line 3 and line 4, I could do an MT, right? And I can get S on its own. Okay, still I don't have any contradictions yet, but we're working on it. What else can I do? Well, you might notice with line 2 and line 6, I could do an MP and I could get not R. Oh, and look, now I do have a contradiction. Look at line 5 and line 7. Line 5 is R, line 7 is not R. Those are contradictions of each other, right? So let's put those together and make the contradiction explicit. So on line 8, I'll use conjunction introduction, create a contradiction, R and not R, right? Couldn't be more obvious that that is contradictory. If you ran a truth table on that, you would definitely get a contradiction. That is false, right? In every possible assignment of truth values. So then, now that we've drawn a contradiction, right? We've derived a contradiction by assuming not Q, move back into the real world, and not Q has to be false, right? If not Q ends up in a contradiction, it must be false. So we can move back into the real world and say Q is true, right? Because if not Q is false, Q is true. And our justification there is our whole little subderivation, lines 4 through 8, ID, indirect derivation. So that's how you do it. Let's try one more for practice. So as I mentioned, right, the clues to when to use indirect derivation is maybe you see the premises and you kind of see a contradiction lurking there, right? That can be a little tricky depending on how complicated the premises are. But if something pops out at you as like, oh, I think a contradiction could fall out of this with a couple moves, then yeah, that's a good idea that you could use an indirect derivation. But probably more frequently, if you sort of tried to do a direct derivation and can't get it, you could always try an indirect derivation. It turns out that anything that can be proven with an indirect derivation. So indirect derivation is always your last stop. You could always do it that way. It's just sometimes harder and more complicated to do. Likewise, if you can't do it with a conditional derivation, an indirect derivation is also good. Okay, let's practice one more, and then you can practice them on your own homework. Feel free to reach out in the discussions if you are getting stuck, and reach out to me. So here we've got 4 premises, and here's our conclusion. So the premises are a little bit ugly, right? We've got a if not P, then if R, then S. Premise 2, if R, then S, then T. We've got negation of T on line 3. 4 is also kind of complicated. If Q, then if R, then S. And the thing we're trying to prove at the end of it is the negation of a condition. Okay, so maybe you've tried it a little bit and you realize direct derivation just isn't working for you. And at first you might think, oh, I could do a conditional derivation because my conclusion is a conditional, right? No, it's not. Your conclusion is actually a negation, right? Even though there's a conditional in there, the main operator is negation. So if you've tried everything you can, it's starting to look like indirect derivation is your only option. Here's what you do. So again, assume the negation of what you're trying to prove. Here, since what you're trying to prove is a negation, you can assume P then Q, right? But unnegated. So conclusion and 5 are negations of each other, right? So we've assumed the opposite of what we're trying to prove. And then let's see if we can get a contradiction to fall out of this somehow. Well, we could do 2 and 3 modus tollens, right? And maybe you already tried that if you're trying to prove it with a direct derivation. So you might already have that on the board, and that's fine. You can still use that. So we got the negation of if R then S, right? With 2, 3 modus tollens. Now that we've got that on line 6, you might notice that it's the negation of the consequent of premise 1. So you can do another modus tollens and get the negation of the antecedent of 1, which happens to be P, right? Okay, notice we've assumed if P then Q, so that means with 5 and 7, we can get Q, in our imaginary world. And so we're making some progress, but are we nearing a contradiction at all, right? You could start to try to strategize, right? If you see a possibility for a contradiction, you might notice, oh, I see 2 and 3, there's not T and there's a T. If only I could get those on their own, there'd be a contradiction. Or maybe you just keep trying stuff, right? Again, as with any derivation, it's the same for conditional derivations, indirect derivations. You try stuff from the top-down strategy, you strategize working backwards, and you kind of rock back between those two until you meet in the middle. But here I'm noticing that with 4 and 6, right? I can do a mode of stolens, I can get not Q. And now I've got my contradiction right there. There may have been other ways to get it, right? There may be other contradictions lurking as well. That's always possible. But we found it, right? So we are done. We just have to make the contradiction explicit. So on line 10 with conjunction introduction, I'll say Q and not Q, line 8 and 9. And now I can step back into the real world and say, well, since if P then Q gave me a contradiction, that's got to be false. So not P then Q is true. And my justification is lines 5 through 10, indirect derivation.